The stability everyone thought they were protecting never actually existed. What existed was a metal trying and failing to support a world that had already outgrown it. The belief in gold's solidity created the illusion that physical discipline could restrain economic ambition. But economies don't behave like metal. They expand even when the system tries to contain them. Gold imposed boundaries. The major powers needed movement. That was the first fracture. The world grew faster than its own anchor. Each new layer of trade, credit, and interdependence pushed the system past what a metallic foundation could carry. But that wasn't the real problem. The rigidity that seemed like safety became an invisible limit. The more the world depended on global flows, the more gold exposed its own inadequacy. The economy wanted speed. Gold only offered weight. The old structures began to strain. Liquidity needs surged like a current, but the physical supply didn't move. The system couldn't keep up with its own size. The hidden cost hadn't surfaced yet. The trust promised by the gold standard was static. But the economy it was meant to protect was dynamic, unpredictable, and constantly expanding. The contradiction was quiet but relentless, and there was another fracture. A metallic discipline only works if everyone obeys it. One diverted flow, one rising pressure, one great power demanding expansion, and the entire balance exposed its fragility. This is where the architecture truly reveals itself. Gold didn't break. The world just became too big to fit inside it. If this analysis resonates with you, share your view in the comments. It pushes this investigation further. The economy grew faster than the structure that was supposed to contain it. And that's when the metal began to show the limit no one wanted to admit. The forces of the time realized that growth itself created a paradox. The more the world expanded, the less room there was for gold to sustain it. But that wasn't the real problem. The real tension came from the fact that global trade flows were multiplying at a speed the physical supply could never match. And the system pretended it was possible to maintain balance without changing its foundation. With every expansion of global commerce, the rigidity of the metal became more visible. But that visibility wasn't treated as a warning, it was treated as a threat. The invisible cost hadn't appeared yet. The existing structures tried to extend the appearance of stability, using mechanisms that increased their dependence on gold itself. And the more they depended on it, the more fragile they became. It was a contradiction growing from within. And no one could admit that the system's central pillar could no longer hold the weight of expansion. What looked like a solution only amplified the risk. The central banks involved kept adjusting controls to preserve the symbolic parity, but every adjustment created new asymmetries. And those asymmetries pushed the world toward a pressure point that couldn't be reversed. The system knew there was no escape within its own design. It just couldn't say it. If this analysis makes sense to you, leave your perspective in the comments. It pushes this investigation further. The rigidity of gold wasn't the final limit. It was only the first layer of a much deeper impasse. The economy needed speed, but gold only offered weight. And it was in that silent friction that the system began to reveal its real anatomy. The structure depended on a finite metal to sustain flows that kept expanding. But every expansion demanded an elasticity that gold could never provide. And still, that didn't reveal the core of the problem. Central banks tried to create compensating mechanisms to preserve the appearance of balance, but every mechanism introduced a new asymmetry. And those asymmetries stacked into layers no one could fully map. What looked like control was just delay. The major powers trusted the discipline of gold as if it were a natural brake on excess. But that brake was locking up the very parts of the system that needed to accelerate. Stability was turning into dysfunction. And dysfunction was turning into dependence. But that still wasn't the real breaking point. The rigidity of gold created a vicious cycle. The more the world grew, the more the metal forced cuts, adjustments, and compression. And every compression left marks that returned as political, economic, and social pressure. The dominant powers pretended they were still in control. But control had already migrated to forces the metal couldn't regulate. The invisible cost was accumulating in the system's own seams. Money needed to keep up with increasingly complex global flows, but it remained tied to an anchor that ignored those movements. And that ignorance created a gap between the size of the economy and the size of the monetary support behind it. That gap kept widening, and it couldn't be closed without breaking the original design. What once sustained the system no longer sustained anything. It only looked like it did. If this analysis makes sense to you, leave your perspective in the comments. It pushes this investigation further. Gold hadn't collapsed yet, but everything around it was already signaling that the rupture was inevitable. When the economy outgrew the limits of gold, the system didn't collapse immediately. It simply revealed that it no longer responded to the anchor it was built on. The rigidity that once projected confidence now functioned like an anchor stuck to the ocean floor. While the rest of the structure was being pulled by forces, it could no longer slow down. But that wasn't the collapse. It was the warning. The major powers tried to preserve the appearance of control, adjusting flows, redesigning commitments, and creating temporary mechanisms to hold back the pressure. But every attempt to protect the metal required even bigger distortions in the rest of the machinery. The system was no longer aligned with its foundation. It only looked like it was. The invisible cost was starting to materialize. To protect gold, the world had to sacrifice its own expansion. And sacrificing expansion meant suffocating the very logic that kept the structure alive. The contradiction became explicit. Gold promised stability, but imposed austerity on flows that were already operating at a different scale. Money got stuck. The economy kept moving. And the friction between those two forces generated tensions no policy could neutralize. But the real limit wasn't in the metal. It was in the inability of a global system to accept a pace that it had created for itself. The invisible gears that supported trade, credit, and interdependence stopped obeying the logic of a physical anchor. They obeyed growth. And growth didn't recognize gold as an authority. The system, which once relied on a metal to prevent excess, now needed flexibility to prevent collapse, and metal offered none. The paradox was complete. Gold guaranteed confidence but destroyed functionality. And without functionality, confidence becomes meaningless. The rupture didn't happen because someone chose it. It happened because the structure no longer fit inside the frame that once supported it. And the uncomfortable truth is that nothing prevented another system from emerging with the same flaws embedded, just reorganized in new layers. If this episode clarified something for you, share your perspective in the comments and follow the next chapters. There are more layers to expose.